Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Happy we actually were able to start on time this week. So this week, the class, of course, if you want to sponsor class, sponsorships are available. We appreciate it. I'll just make two dedications for this class. First of all, we want to dedicate this class Le'ilei Nishmas Moshe Yehuda ben Tzvi Yosef, Rabbi Moshe Kolarski, who was one of the pioneers of Chabad in America, and his yard site is tonight. So we will dedicate it to his memory, as well as Pinchas Levi Yitzchak and Leib, who passed away a few days ago, father of a good friend of mine. So we'll do this in his memory as well. Okay, so let's jump in. So this week we're going to actually, because this is the week before Shavuos, next week we're not going to have a class. It's going to be Shavuos, God willing. And if you're in the area, we'd love to see you for some cheesecake and 10 Commandments. So we're going to focus on an idea of something that changed by Matan Torah, by the giving of the Torah, that didn't exist before that. We all know that our forefathers, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as well as the Jewish people, even in the land of Egypt, they studied the Torah in some way. And the Torah that they had, famously, they kept Passover and other mitzvahs that are in obviously not in the same way. We all know about a bris milah that Abraham did. So what really changed in this time? So our sages tell us that one of the things that changed is that during the giving of the Torah became ours. And we had this really wasn't about necessarily the actual Torah, but it was about the connection between God and the Jewish people. And one of the things that we see by the giving of the Torah, that was revealed, if you will, by the giving of the Torah, is our sages tell us that Anochi, the word that starts the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God, right? That word stands for Ana Nafshi Ksavas Yahavas, that God put himself, he wrote himself into the Torah. So by saying that changes the whole idea of what Torah is. Torah is God's will, Torah is eternal, and we're going to talk a little bit now about how we're trying to understand the eternity of the Torah. So there are, specifically, we're going to bring up two different types of things that seemingly are not so eternal that are in the Torah, and why it matters. So let's start with the first thing, which is going to be the main topic of tonight, is the medical advice in the Talmud. Now, the medical advice in the Talmud is in the Talmud, and seemingly, if it's in the Talmud, and the Talmud is part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, which is also eternal, how can we say that this medical advice that's in the Talmud is eternal when we don't follow this advice? Now, why don't we follow this advice? Because the advice in the Talmud is what we would call defunct, or it is no longer considered modern medical, modern medical standards. And there are a lot of things in the Talmud that you would find medically, we would find objectionable, again, as medical advice. So our sages tell us that not only is the medical advice in the Talmud not necessarily up to date, we are not allowed to follow the medical advice in the Talmud. Why? Because that when it comes to the medical advice of the Talmud, the nature of the world has changed. Not that the Torah has changed, but the nature of the world has changed. But if you're saying that the nature of the world has changed and this advice is no longer applicable, how can we say that this is part of the eternal Torah? And now, so you tell me, okay, so Rabbi, there are some things in the Talmud that are eternal, there are some things that are not, that are, and some things that aren't. Okay, you could make that argument, but let's say a person gets up in the morning and he wants to study Torah. The Torah tells us before you study Torah, the rabbis tell us we have to make a blessing on the Torah. We make a blessing. We say it every day before we start our day. This one of the first things we say in the morning is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'tzvos v'tzivanu noisen haTorah. That we thank God that He has given us the Torah. And there's actually a few blessings that we say, and then we right away we study a little bit of Torah. We study a paragraph. We study a few verses in the Torah, specifically the blessing of the priest, and then we study a little bit of Mishnayos because we want to study from the oral Torah and the written Torah, and that way we just like you make a blessing right away. You have to eat the food that you made a blessing on. So too right away we make a blessing on the Torah. We right away learn a little bit of Torah. And that Torah blessing is good for the whole day. So let's say I got up in the morning and I want to study a portion of the Talmud that discusses the medical advice of the Talmud. Do I have to say a blessing on the Torah blessings for this portion? If you tell me that it's part of the eternal Torah, of course, it's a part of Torah. The same way the oral Torah was all given from God on Sinai, the same way the rest of the Talmud, the same way the 5 books of Moses and all the parts of the Torah. So, do I have to make a blessing or not? So, and that's the first kind of distinction we're going to make. Secondly, we're going to go into, if we look at Maimonides specifically, he actually brings it in his book of laws. Maimonides wrote a code of laws. He did not write the parts of the Talmud that tell stories or moral lessons. He did write a book called Moreh Nevuchim where he talks about, Jewish philosophy. But in the book of Mishnah Torah, the Maimonides, we could see right behind me, Maimonides only brings laws, only things that are relevant to law. And in fact, he doesn't even bring the reasons for the laws. He specifically omits it so you don't get mixed up, you don't get confused about what is the law and what is the reason for the law, which Maimonides was criticized for, but proved to be, in a way, correct in his assertion that bringing too much information would confuse people. And so Maimonides only has the laws. In the laws, actually, right in the first book of Mishnah Torah, there are 14 books. He starts off as follows. In Hilchos Deis, it's the first section of the Maimonides, or I should maybe actually say the second section. He says that there's Hilchos Deis, and he brings a whole chapter. Chapter 4, he says that he's going to explain a whole chapter of health advice. Why? The body being healthy is part of service of God. So if you're telling me the body being healthy is part of the service of God, and it's in a book of law, you can't make the argument anymore that this is part of the Talmud, that is, a story or a moral lesson or something like that. It must be that this is a law, and if it's a law in the Torah, that means there's no funny business. This is eternal. So how can you tell me that this advice is eternal? And not only that, the Maimonides specifically, he says we can't follow the Talmud's advice. The Talmud's advice is expired. And then Maimonides brings his modern medical advice, that's almost 1,000 years ago. That medical advice has been expired. So how can we kind of square this circle of the Torah's eternity at the same time we're saying that the advice is no longer relevant? Okay. So the one way we could kind of another way we could kind of look at this is from a different perspective. Instead of looking at it from specifically the medical advice in the Torah, there's something else. There's other things in the Torah that are no longer quote unquote relevant. For example, there is a mitzvah in the Torah that we have to conquer the land of Israel, and we have to fight and battle and remove the 7 nations that live there. Now that was completed in the times of Joshua, at least mostly. And that's not a mitzvah that's relevant nowadays. Not because we don't have the things, which we'll talk about that in a second, but it was completed. And seemingly that when it comes to a mitzvah, whenever we count one of the 613 mitzvahs, generally speaking, They are mitzvahs that are for eternity, as we just explained. Meaning, there are mitzvahs in the Torah that are specifically not for eternity. For example, when Moses tells the Jewish people something to do only in the desert. For example, that they should take the manna and they should eat the manna and they shouldn't leave the manna over. There's all these kind of commandments related to the manna. Those are not part of the 613 commandments, except for the one that they should leave in the temple. That I believe is part of 613, but don't quote me on that. Don't have it in front of me. But in general, if it's relevant to the generation of the desert, that's not a mitzvah for all eternity. There's a mitzvah. They had a mitzvah that Moses told them to bring spies. Right? God told them, if you want, you could get spies. That's not a mitzvah for eternity. The Jewish people should walk through. They should walk through the splitting of the sea. That's not a mitzvah for eternity. But we have mitzvahs that are for eternity that were already accomplished. Like we said, like there's a mitzvah to have remove the 7 nations from the land of Israel. Then we have the third category, which we kind of alluded to, which is we have this category of mitzvahs that are no longer relevant because we don't have the Holy Temple and we're not in the land of Israel. So again, the question is, if these mitzvahs are eternal, how do we explain that they're no longer relevant? They don't apply. In other words, I can't do, not just me, but there's no Jew in the world that today could get up in the morning and bring the sacrifices to the temple. It's not possible until Mashiach comes. So if these mitzvahs are eternal, and the Torah is eternal, how could it be that there are situations in life that doesn't apply? So the truth is that if we look at it, is that really the Torah, because the Torah is eternal, the Torah talks in a way of eternity, which means the Torah looks at the way things are in truth. And in truth is that the world is a place that bodies are that the nature and bodies are in a certain way. The truth is that the Torah looks at the truth of the way the world is supposed to be, and then that truth has to be applied. Which means, if because of the Jewish people they sinned, there's no longer a temple, we can't do the mitzvahs. If the Jewish people, since we are no longer have the strength of bodies that we had in the times of the Talmud, therefore the medical advice in the Talmud no longer applies. So, but spiritually, on a spiritual level, all these things still apply, which means that they are eternal. That the Torah, in other words, the way it connects to God, the way you connect to God, is eternal. And the same thing applies when it comes to Maimonides' medical advice. That Maimonides is really telling us that he's explaining that he's really saying that these ideas, this medical advice that he's giving, really has spiritual power, and this is in other words, this is the way the body is supposed to be. And Maimonides was speaking to people at that time, obviously, but Maimonides doesn't say, come back, check in 10 years, see if there's been a peer-reviewed study on this stuff. Because Maimonides, and he put it in his book of laws, because Maimonides is speaking to the way things truly are. And spiritually, it's still relevant. Now, we all know that if the world isn't, the world might not be, it might not be in a perfect way, in a perfect situation, as we just explained. But what we could see is that through the study of Torah and studying these ideas, as we just said, we could make a blessing. If we're going to study the chapter 4 in Hilchos Deis, in Maimonides, if we're going to study that chapter, we do say a blessing. And you could say Noisen Torah. You could say that God gave us the Torah, and we could study this. And through the study of that is how we could connect. We could connect to God. That is how we could connect to these deep spiritual ideas, and we bring it down in a physical, in almost in a physical way. In other words, we don't study these ideas as spiritual ideas. If we were to study them as spiritual ideas, we would, and as spirituality, it wouldn't be relevant to us down here in this world. So specifically, we're supposed to study it in a way as medical advice. In other words, in a way that's relevant to our realm. And that itself is what brings down and helps us connect to these deep spiritual spiritual ideas. And as we as we come to Shavuos, as we're now coming to Shavuos next week, as we mentioned, it is important for us to realize that we all have this intrinsic connection to the Torah, and that the Torah is the wisdom of God, and that if we want to be connected to Hashem, we want to be connected to God, we want to be connected to God's will, we want to be connected to God's wisdom, we have to study the Torah, and we have to engage in the study of Torah. And when we study these ideas, it's not just that we're gonna be knowledgeable. That's not what the Shavuos is about. Shavuos is not about collecting knowledge. We don't spend In fact, there's a custom in the night of Shavuos that we read sections of the Torah. Some people have a custom, they actually study Torah, but the Chabad custom in many communities, the custom is, and this is how the custom originated about 500 years ago, is we stay up all night, the night of Shavuos, and we read sections of the Torah. In other words, we're showing God that we have this deep connection to the Torah. That's what happened by the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. As we mentioned in the beginning, there was Torah before. In other words, there was knowledge before, and it was godly knowledge. But what happened by the giving of the Torah was that this knowledge became relevant to me and you. This knowledge of Torah, this is as we say, a inheritance. It's a gift that God gave us, and it's something that we have a deep connection with. This isn't some random knowledge that's relevant to people in a faraway place, in a faraway time, in a place that we don't live, to people that we don't know. This is our connection to God. And this is a way, this idea that we see that there is practical, the Torah addresses everything. The Torah addresses medicine, the Torah addresses health, the Torah addresses this physical realm. That is how we know that this is relevant to us. Yes, there are mitzvahs that don't apply nowadays. Unfortunately, we're no longer in that state. God willing, though, through studying the Torah, through connecting to God, through this endeavor of connecting to God through studying the Torah and knowing that we have this deep, deep connection to the Torah, and of course, the mitzvahs of the Torah, through this we will bring about the coming of Mashiach. And through the coming of Mashiach, it will be obvious to everybody that there is no contradiction between the world and the Torah. We'll see how the world will be reinstated to its proper place in a way that all the laws of the Torah, whether it's the Holy Temple, or the medical advice of the Torah, or mitzvahs that we already accomplished, we will see how all these things are relevant to each and every one of us. Thank you very much for joining. Have a wonderful Shabbos and have a good Yom Tov next week. And God willing, we'll see you in a few weeks.